Okay, welcome back. And now we are about to start into proportions. And again, I mentioned that proportions may not to you be the most exciting thing to talk about. I am sure if you had a list, the study of proportions would not be at the top of what you were here to study. Everybody wants to study biceps, triceps, pectoral muscles, all the hero things that they can use to make creatures or whatever it is that you're after. But proportions is never one of the main things. And the reason being is that it's not sexy. But what it is an insurance policy that your figure will not be ridiculous. Because there are a number of instances, and we'll see some later on in the lecture, where people have fantastically rendered anatomy and they understand thoroughly muscles, origins, insertions, shapes, and volumes, but they have terrible proportions on their figure. And as a result, all of the work that's invested in beautiful rendering, beautiful structure is lost because the proportions are ridiculous and it becomes a laughingstock. And so what this is a lecture on how to assess your own work for correct proportions and to give you some guides to use as sanity checks when you get into this space where you think that something may be falling out of shape or getting a little bit ridiculous, that you can use some tools to help you correct it and get it back into shape. Okay, so the source for these slides and a lot of the stuff that we're going to see in this course is a guy named Paul Richet and his book Art Anatomy, which some of you may recognize the cover. This is the English translation of the original French book. And the book itself is from Dr. Paul Richet, who is a medical doctor, but also the instructor at the French Royal Academy, instructor of anatomy at this period in the 19th century when all of the great figure sculptors of that age were going through and studying. And so what he taught is a lot of the stuff that we see, kind of the knowledge that we see so beautifully expressed in this period's work. And so it's a great place to start. And this is a fantastic book if you're looking for a primary resource on anatomy, because it again is a first-hand account from one of the best instructors of all time. And probably every 20th century anatomy book you read references or even directly rips off this guy's stuff. So pick up the original if you can. It's hard to work through, but it's worth it. Okay, so let's get back to the proportions slide. And there is a lot of information on this figure you see in front of you. And I'm going to try to cover all the relevant information so that you can use it as a tool in your own work. First thing that we have to understand is this is 7 1/2 heads tall. And this is a canon of proportions, a measurement system for assessing proportions. So based on a unit of one head, which is actually quite useful and a fairly novel idea to use. Probably not to us anymore, a novel idea, but at the time, using one head as your unit of measurement was kind of interesting. Previous attempts, canons of proportions, have been around for thousands of years. The Greeks had them, and they had a few fairly ridiculous canons of proportion. Things like how many eyewidths tall is somebody, how many eyewidths long is somebody's arm. So they were using this as their atom or their unit of measurement, which artistically is not the most valuable tool because you can't quickly assess it. But Paul Richet studied actually a lot of people, and he came up with 7 1/2 heads as the average, right? And so when we're talking about average, and I'll do a little drawing here on the left, and the drawing is of the bell curve, right? The average is right down the middle. All right, so when we're talking about 7 1/2 heads, he measured a bunch of people, and 7 1/2 is the average. There is ridiculous variations on either end of the bell curve, but we're concentrating on this middle section. Because anything can happen out here. Ridiculous things happen. 4 legs on people, 8 foot tall, things that don't occur in the middle. So 7.5 heads isn't for everything, but it is for us as a starting point. So, what is the utility of this? 7.5 heads was constructed to give useful landmarks working your way from the top down. So 4 heads from the top down. 1 head gives you, well, the head to start with. 2 heads brings you down to the line of the nipple, right? Which is kind of roughly the bottom of the pectoral muscle, slightly above the bottom of the pectoral muscle. 3 heads, the navel, but also probably more importantly kind of bisects midway through this love handle or the external oblique. And 4 heads down, the last head brings us to a line that actually bisects this guy's tackle, which is not too pleasant, but if we extend the line down, this actually comes in line with the fold of the buttocks on the side and the back. So that's 4 heads. Very useful, just as a broad measurement tool. The secret to 7.5 heads, obviously, is that we have half a head missing somewhere. So we do 4 from the top down, and then we're going to do 4 from the bottom up. And I'll use a different color. So 4 from the bottom up, it's going to be like this. Bring us up to here. And if I count heads, the first head is some arbitrary line, middle of the calf, so not a useful landmark. But the second of 2 heads from the bottom up is a fantastic reference. This is 2 heads to the bendy point of the knee, or the top of the tibia, crest of the tibia. So fantastic way to help you assess the length of the segments of the leg. Because if you're like me, I have a problem with making my legs the right length. I might have short legs myself, but also I think that we're all inclined to discount the height of the legs because we look at people typically in the face and the legs are cast off into perspective, so we don't appreciate fully the exact proportions of them. So, continuing our count, 2 from the bottom up lands us at the bend point of the knee. 3, again, an arbitrary point mid-thigh. But 4, 4th head from the ground up, is actually a very interesting point because this drops us, if you look on the side of the slide, right here. And you can see kind of dotted, highlighted, the femur. 4 heads from the ground up drops us right at the rotation point of the upper leg, where the hip bone goes into the socket. Right, so the ball and socket joint for the hip is right there at 4. Okay, that's a little bit of a mess on the slide. You can rewind and see it done again. I'm going to erase the ink, and we're going to look at a few more important things that are a little more subtle on this plate. One is length of the arm. Right, so on the outstretched arm, from roughly the point of rotation of the shoulder, a little bit further down actually if you look at it. This is the point of rotation, slightly further down. The outstretched arm is 3 heads, so 1, 2, 3. First head bringing you to roughly the bendy point of the elbow, bottom of the biceps. Second head bringing you to a line a little bit removed from the wrist, so again, fairly arbitrary. And the third head brings you all the way to the end of the outstretched fingers. Okay, so 3 heads. Man is 2 heads wide, shoulder to shoulder, which is what this says. And then again, same thing here on the outstretched arm, or the arm by the side is 3 heads. Okay, well enough, that's fine. I want to draw your attention to 3 more things, I guess, on this plate. And interesting points are, you can see in dotted lines going down the arm and up the leg are a little dotted line through these three segments. And what this illustrates are segments of equal length in the body. Right, so if you can imagine, and you're going to have to do this yourself, sitting in front of your computer, wherever you're watching this, that we're talking about equal segment from top of your shoulder, top of the clavicle right there, through the bendy point of the elbow to the midpoint of the palm. So what this means is kind of a functional check for the arm, is that if you take your arm and you bend it, palm stretched out, bend at the elbow until it's all the way up, that you can have roughly your hand, top of your palm, should be at the level of the top of your shoulder. And this is a very good check for if you're working in computers as a rigger or somebody building kind of a bone structure into an armature. It's a good check for proportions between upper arm and lower arm. And also a functional check because that's how the arm works, is this roughly has to fall in line with this. Okay, the same thing with the lower leg. We have a point at the bottom of the foot, a point going right through the patella, so right through the knee, and a point here, and I'm going to change colors and make it red because this is our first introduction to a critical landmark on the skeleton. And I'm going to say the name. The name is the anterior superior iliac spine. And you're probably going to hate me for saying the true Latin name because it's a mouthful and it's hard to understand and it's a lot to know. But throughout the course, I'm going to use the proper names for all of these places, all of the anatomy on the body. Because, one, it's a very precise method of talking about anatomy, but two, it will enable you to go back and study for yourselves and read things like Art Anatomy by Paul Richet. Because part of the problem with reading this as just a new student to anatomy is that he spares no beginner any of the trouble of working through the names because he just goes in with all the names straight away. So I will tell you and expose them to you so you can study further on, but also so you can speak a common language amongst yourselves. And I can speak to you in a common language. Okay, so anterior superior iliac spine, I'll explain more to you about that in the skeleton lecture, through the patella to the bottom of the foot. So imagine this is the runner's stretch, where you're stretching your quadricep muscles. Pull your heel back to your butt or up to your hip, and these two segments should be equal. The bottom of your heel should come up to this point. And again, it's a good functional check of the proportions of upper and lower leg together. Okay, let me erase the pen. And I'm going to cover one last thing on this image. I lied, two more things. It's ongoing, never ending, but it's all useful information. So you would want to absorb this if you can. So again, talked about the segments of equal length on the arm and the hip. Here we have an interesting two-headed stack. So this line segment here is indicating two heads. And this is two heads from the anterior superior iliac spine, which is the bony point that helps us separate the upper body from the lower body, right? Upper body from lower body. Two heads above that is the top of the clavicle, right? So the very top of the torso. And keeping this in mind when you're constructing a figure will help you eliminate a very common problem that I see in people's work, which is called the long torso syndrome. Often people make this segment between hip and shoulder far too tall. And what they're left with is a vast expanse of torso in the middle of the body where, say this becomes the length of the rectus abdominis, where they have to fill in anatomy that is not properly proportioned because they have no choice. Their proportions are so wrong. They do things like putting way too many abdominal packs in the stomach to make to fill the space for no other reason than an error in proportions at the start. So keep an eye on this proportion. It's a good one to look out for. Okay, it's a good time to introduce average man. And this is my average man. We'll see him again and again in the lectures. He also features prominently in the Bodies in Motion library, which you have access to. In fact, his rigging set, his deformation set, is the most comprehensive of any in the Bodies in Motion library. So pretty much any articulation you can do with your body is in there. So you can see how this guy's figure reacts to the different poses, how the pull of muscles from origin to insertion change as he moves. So definitely look for that. He is average man because although the women may think he's above average, he works out to be about 7.5 heads, nearly corresponding exactly with the proportions we looked at in the Paul Rocher plate. Right, so all the landmarks that we're talking about, level of the nipples, navel, a little high, but bisects kind of the oblique muscle. Fourth head going from the top down through the balls, ouch, but also the fold of the buttocks in the back. Ground up, 2 heads, roughly the bending point of the knee, and then 2 more heads would put us right about at the bending point of the hip, so that's cool. And then if we look at the stack of 2 heads that I just mentioned, take 2 heads from the anterior superior iliac spine to the top of the clavicle, and we're just about there. So he conforms fairly well to these proportions. And so you can be assured when you're looking at reference from him that he is a pretty good average person. Okay, it does us little good to just study the front, so we need to also go in and look at proportions in the back. Because, again, we can't neglect the back as much as some people tend to ignore it. You will have to render it, sculpt it, rig it sometimes, so we need to understand it in as much depth. So in the same way as the front, there's other critical landmarks working our way down from the top and the back. So what we have is first head, second head kind of goes down to roughly the fold of the shoulder, right? So where the arm folds into the armpit. Third head is kind of interesting because the third head actually brings us to the height of the pelvis. And we'll see in the skeleton lecture what that actually looks like. This big kind of crest of pelvis is called the iliac crest. And there's actually another bony point here called the posterior superior iliac spine. We've seen its neighbor, the anterior superior iliac spine in the front, but in the back it's called posterior superior. So that should be a little bit of a clue to you how the naming for this sort of thing comes together. Okay, so that's 3 down to the top of the iliac crest. 4 down, it's the fold of the buttocks, as we saw in the front view. Okay, same again from the bottom up. 1, 2, bend of the knee, and the back, 3, 4, brings us to this point, which I'm going to erase the ink. This point, it does have an anatomical name, but for the longest time we didn't have it, and so in one of my courses we actually coined it the Brachius maximus. So the gluteal cleft is known in this course as the Brachius maximus, and together with the posterior superior iliac spines we have something called the sacral triangle. Right, so just a couple relationship between landmarks in the back of the hips is the sacral triangle. Okay, so again, Brachius maximus, 4 heads from the bottom up. Fold of the buttocks, 4 heads from the bottom down. And now we'll look at a couple of the segments, or we don't have any segments of equal proportion, but we have a couple interesting relationships of two heads. And this is one. In the same way as in the front, we had anterior superior iliac spine from to the top of the clavicle. In the back, we have posterior superior iliac spine right here to this landmark sitting right in the back of the neck. And this is called the 7th cervical vertebra. Oh, excuse me, 7th. I have 7.5 in my mind. Cervical vertebra. And we'll see this again in our landmark lecture, skeleton and landmarks. But again, two heads from here to here. Everybody can just take a moment and feel this for yourselves on the back of your neck. It's the first spine, spinous process of the vertebra that you'll feel going down in your neck. And we'll explain the reason for that when we talk more about the skeleton. Okay, so two heads from there to there. And then we'll look at this relationship right here. One head. One head from the top of the trapezius, kind of the top of the shoulder muscle here, to the bottom of this bone, which is the scapula. Right? You're going to love to hate the scapula because of the complexity of all the muscle attachments and the shape. But hopefully, as we get through all the information and all the knowledge about the scapula, you'll love it because you can do fantastic things with the upper back when you understand it. Okay, so that's one head. And this, again, will help solve a number of problems that I see, like scapulas that are this long. You know, when people just have no idea how it actually is shaped or proportioned. So a little proportional check will keep that from being too ridiculous. Okay, I think at a broad assessment that is most of the critical information on this slide. So without further ado, we'll skip forward, look at average man from the back, and see that even on the back he conforms fairly well to the landmarks we're talking about. So posterior superior iliac spine, 7th cervical vertebra, right there. Top of the iliac crest is roughly in line with the third head from the top down. Brachius maximus is the 4th from the ground up. Sacral triangle would be like that. And you can continue to look at this. This is in the lecture notes as well. Okay, moving forward. This is a good reason, a good example why we study proportions. This guy is a fantastic artist, a guy named Jeffrey Jones. And these are two paintings by him on different days, but roughly the same subject matter. And you can quickly look at this on the left and see, yeah, looks good. And on the right, you can quickly look at it and say, actually, something is wrong with his right arm. Okay, and if we're going to really diagnose this with the tools that we've just studied from those plates, the first thing that springs to mind is the segments of equal length that we did with our outstretched hand, palm to top of the shoulder, through the bend in the elbow. All right, so it's this segment. And then all the way down to here. Outstretch the palm. I'm kind of interpolating, supposing that he had his hand out. It would be about that length. You can see that those segments visually are good enough for us. We do the same thing on the guy on the right, top of the clavicle, down through the bend in the elbow, right there, get with me, to top of the palm. You can see that he is about half a head too long in this segment. And that's giving, of course, the obvious impression of a really long forearm from here to here. Right, so if we were going to fix this, we'd have to excise a little bit of bone and bring that back, and then he would probably be in roughly the correct proportion. And that is, again, the reason why we have these sanity checks of proportions, because you never know when things are going to go off track, and it often goes off track for me when I'm working on a sculpture or a drawing, and I need to actually use these, either measure with my pencil or to pull heads off, to actually physically pull heads off of my model if I'm working in 3D, and stack them one on top of the other to get the correct proportions, just as a sanity check. Because sometimes you just lose sight of it yourself. Your vision fails you after you've been working into details for so long. Okay, now we're to a place where we're going to see our first image from the gallery abominant. And this is the first introduction. We'll live with the gallery abominant for the next 8 weeks. So it's fun, but it hopefully is instructive. And it's about finding problems with anatomy or proportions or something on works that are actually very, very accomplished. And you can look at this and see, damn, it misses the mark. And the reason it misses the mark is obviously proportions of his arm in relation to the body. And again, even in a broader sense, I think this is a failure in perspective. And this guy is Frank Frazetta, if you're not familiar with him, the godfather of fantasy art, and a brilliant painter in his own right. Fails a little bit to cast the arms correctly off into perspective. And so they look about half a head too short. But beyond that, looking overall at the size of his head in relationship to the landmarks that we're talking about, we start to stack these up. This guy is not going to be 7.5 heads. He's not going to be 8 heads, which would be more impressive in stature. He would probably come in at about 6 heads, top to bottom, which is equivalent to somebody maybe 5'4", so when you get shorter, you're fewer heads tall. So if Conan, who I think this is coming at me, I would probably put my hand on his forehead, my outstretched arm, and he would be swinging his battle axe, but he wouldn't be able to get to me because he has such ridiculously short proportions. And I would keep him at bay with an easy defense, with a Three Stooges defense, and then I would wait till he was too tired to swing anymore, and I would walk away. Confrontation dispelled. Okay, so first trip in the gallery abominant, you may see some of your work in there. I've had people on the courses in the past who have had their work in there. Please let me know if your work is in the gallery abominant and you want it removed. But hopefully, if it's in there because, one, it's very good, but two, it has some critical anatomical error. There we go, into the brightness. Right, so it has to be both of those to be in the gallery abominant. And again, we'll see quite a few images, and we'll dissect them, and we'll talk about what went wrong. Okay, moving on a little bit forward, I'm going to just put a caveat in the whole lecture about proportions and say that these are, our 7.5 head figure is an average person. And people don't recognize this plate. This plate is taken from a guy named Andrew Loomis, who was a turn-of-the-century kind of illustrator in the U.S. in the golden age of illustration. And he wrote 4 or 5 books in the 1920s that are fantastic reference books. And I put in one of them in the download section. In fact, it's this one, the one that references this plate, called Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, I believe is what it's called. And it's a fantastic resource for you because he was a brilliant illustrator and he was extremely familiar with the figure. He was a fashion illustrator, so most of his stuff had to be beautiful and very impressive because it was used in ads in this age when they didn't have, kind of right before photography became mainstream in advertising. So they would paint these kind of very rugged figures or very beautiful ladies. And so he was interested in using people more impressive in stature, 8.5 heads. And he said 7.5 heads. The guy that we're talking about, academic proportions, he said it was rather dumpy. And for his purposes, it was rather dumpy. In fact, to highlight the point of being rather dumpy, he's given this guy a little pedophile mustache and a really, really bad comb over to really dissuade you from using 7.5 heads. But if you need average guy, 7.5 heads is your trick. Beyond that, you're getting into things that are more impressive in stature, taller as well, to the point where over here we're into heroic proportions, Greek, kind of statuesque, and kind of on this point, this is 9 heads. Way off the end of the scale over here is some of the stuff that Michelangelo did when he was at the end of his career, where he was talking like 12 heads tall. Really, really ridiculously proportioned stuff. So again, proportions are your friend. They're a tool, and you can exaggerate along this axis as much as you need to get the point across in your work. But it's good to have a starting point as a reference, and then you can modify that to get to where you need to be. Okay, as you would expect, assessing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bruce Lee, you would say Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, very tall, he's going to be far more heads tall. Bruce Lee, a little shorter than average. He's not going to be probably full 7.5 heads. So if we stack up heads on Kareem, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8.5 heads tall, which for somebody 7 foot plus is probably about right. So you're starting to get a lot of height, a lot of stature when you get more heads tall. Conversely, somebody who's a little bit shorter than average, you're starting to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 heads. So within this kind of scope, you can imagine the landmarks that we looked at in 7.5 heads start to stretch. And you can use Loomis a little bit as a guide for where those landmarks fall with different numbers of heads. Okay, 2 sculptures, both by the same artist. Everybody knows the one on the right, David by Michelangelo, and on the left, Bacchus by Michelangelo. And left, you can say, hopefully a visual assessment of the statue will say, it looks like he has a small head, actually, compared to his body. And if I stack up the heads, I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, not too bad. 7.25. So he's roughly in line with our 7.5 heads. He's kind of average guy. David, on the other hand, on the right, if we look at him, you can say fairly definitely that for somebody of this build, in the bottom half of his body, his head looks very large. Right, and if you stack up heads, he comes out to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heads. So if 7.5 heads is your average 5'10" male, this guy, David, is going to be about 5'6", 5'7", which is not probably the look that Michelangelo was going for. Though in his own defense, and if you know the story, David was meant to be high in a niche on the cathedral in Florence. So it was going to be cast off into perspective for people looking up. So it's said that when he did the head, he took that into account so that the head wouldn't look especially small when viewed in perspective. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they say. Okay, 2 more sculptures. Think to yourself, who is it? Anybody who can identify it? Extra points for you. I'll tell you this is both Rodin. If you don't know Rodin, you need to know him. He's fantastic. And he was a 19th century sculptor in France as well. So the thing about it is he was exposed to these lessons that Richer was teaching. In fact, he applied to the academy where Richer taught 3 times and was turned down 3 times. They say, no way, you're not coming in. So he had to study at a lesser academy, and that's where he learned some of his craft. But he was exposed to this idea of 7.5 heads, this idea of perfect naturalism. And what we get is, on the left, I believe this is John the Baptist, if I'm not mistaken. We have 7.5 heads. And the landmarks fall almost exactly where we saw in the Richer book, or the Richer plate. Looking at this one on the right, we kind of see that he has a small head relative to his body, and he ends up being 8.25 heads tall, which is okay, because that would be roughly equivalent to somebody a little bit above 6 foot tall. Okay, and then to finish off, we have 2 pieces by Michelangelo, kind of at the latter stage of his career. You can start to see what I'm talking about with his proportions becoming less meticulous, less based on observation in life, and more manneristic. And I believe that if you stack this up, it probably is approaching 12. But probably the more egregious offense is side to side. He's probably half head too wide, and probably, again, a half head, maybe 2 heads, a full head too wide in the pelvis. So yeah, extra thick and extra tall. Okay, with that, I'm going to pause and we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we're going to get into the details of the skeleton and landmarks of the upper body. Okay, and I'll see you in a few minutes.